The digital clock on Lieutenant Sarah Chen's tactical display read 11:47 p.m. In exactly 13 minutes, everything she had worked for would be destroyed. 400 soldiers sleeping in their barracks had no idea that enemy forces had already breached the outer perimeter of Fort Harrison. They had no idea that their communications were jammed, their backup systems compromised, and their commanding officers neutralized. They had no idea that their survival now depended entirely on one woman's decision in the next 12 minutes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The maintenance tunnel beneath Fort Harrison's Central Command building had always been Sarah's refuge. While other intelligence officers spent their off-duty hours in the recreation center or their quarters, she found solace in the maze of underground passages that connected every critical facility on the base. Tonight, what started as her usual late-night inspection routine had turned into something far more sinister. Sarah pressed her back against the concrete wall, her breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Through the ventilation grate above her head, she could hear voices speaking in hushed tones. The accent was unmistakably foreign, but the English was perfect. Phase 1 complete. All external communications severed at 2,340 hours, reported a voice she didn't recognize. Confirmed. Internal security cameras are now feeding our loop footage. Base personnel remain unaware, came another response. Sarah carefully adjusted her position to get a better view through the metal slats. 3 figures in dark tactical gear stood around a portable command station they had set up in what should have been an empty storage room. Her heart sank as she recognized the layout on their screens. Detailed schematics of Fort Harrison, including sections that were supposed to be classified. Team Alpha is in position near the armory. Team Beta has secured the vehicle depot. Team Gamma maintains overwatch on the barracks complex, the first voice continued. All units report ready for Phase 2. The leader, a tall man with graying temples, leaned over the display. Outstanding. Colonel Morrison and his senior staff have been contained in the Officers' Club as planned. The sleeping gas deployment was flawless. They'll remain unconscious for at least 6 hours. Sarah's blood ran cold. Colonel Morrison was Fort Harrison's commanding officer, a decorated veteran who had served 3 tours overseas. If he and his staff were compromised, the entire command structure was effectively decapitated. "What's our timeline for the main operation?" asked a woman's voice from the group. "Exactly 11 minutes from now, we will initiate the final phase. The charges are set throughout the ammunition storage facility. When they detonate, the explosion will level everything within a half-mile radius. The media will report it as a tragic accident. Faulty storage protocols, perhaps a maintenance error." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. The ammunition storage facility was located directly beneath the main barracks complex. 400 soldiers were sleeping directly above what would become ground zero of a massive explosion. This wasn't just an attack on military assets. This was mass murder disguised as an accident. "And our extraction?" the woman continued. "Helicopter pickup at Landing Zone Charlie in 15 minutes. We'll be airborne before the first responders even realize what happened." The leader folded his arms, satisfaction evident in his posture. "After tonight, Fort Harrison will be nothing but a crater and a memorial. The intelligence we've gathered here will cripple their Pacific operations for years." Sarah slowly backed away from the grate, her mind racing through possibilities. The standard protocol would be to report to the next highest-ranking officer. But if the senior staff was unconscious and communications were jammed, that could take precious minutes she didn't have. The base's emergency alert system required authorization codes that only Colonel Morrison and his deputy possessed. She made her way through the tunnel system toward the main communication hub, hoping against hope that some backup system remained operational. The tunnels that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a tomb. Every shadow could hide an enemy operative. Every sound could signal discovery. The communications center was 3 levels below ground, accessible only through a series of secured doors that required both keycard access and biometric verification. Sarah's clearance level granted her access to most areas, but she had never attempted to reach the primary communication array during an emergency lockdown. As she approached the first checkpoint, she noticed something wrong immediately. The security station that should have been manned by at least 2 guards stood empty. The monitors that typically displayed feeds from throughout the base showed only static or looped footage, Exactly what the intruders had mentioned. Sarah swiped her card and pressed her palm to the scanner. The system beeped softly and the heavy door slid open with a pneumatic hiss. She moved quickly through the corridor, checking each subsequent checkpoint. All unmanned, all compromised. The main communication hub was a cathedral of technology. Banks of servers, satellite uplinks, and emergency broadcast equipment that could reach military installations across 3 time zones. But as Sarah surveyed the room, her worst fears were confirmed. Critical components had been systematically sabotaged. Cables were severed, circuit boards removed, and backup power systems disabled. A sticky note attached to the main console caught her attention. Written in neat handwriting were the words, "We know you're here, Lieutenant Chen. You have 9 minutes." Sarah's blood turned to ice. They knew she was in the building. They knew her name. This wasn't a random discovery. They had been tracking her movements. She spun around, expecting to find armed figures pointing weapons at her, but the room remained empty. The silence was more terrifying than any threat could have been. They were playing with her, demonstrating their complete control over the situation. 8 minutes. Sarah's training kicked in, overriding the panic that threatened to paralyze her. She began systematically checking every piece of equipment in the room, looking for anything that might still be functional. Most of the primary systems were beyond repair, but in the far corner, she found an older emergency radio that appeared untouched. She powered it up and began cycling through frequencies, searching for any military channel that might be operational. Static filled her earpiece until she reached a frequency used by the night patrol units that operated in the surrounding forest. Night Watch 1, Night Watch 1, this is intelligence base, do you copy? Nothing but static. Any station, this is Fort Harrison Intelligence, emergency authentication code Delta 77 Alpha, requesting immediate assistance. More static, then finally a crackling response. Fort Harrison Intelligence, this is Night Watch 3, we copy your transmission, what's your situation? Sarah nearly collapsed with relief. Night Watch 3, we have enemy infiltration in progress, base command is compromised. I need you to contact higher headquarters immediately and request emergency intervention. Roger that, Intelligence. Stand by for confirmation of your authentication code. 7 minutes. Sarah provided her identification and explained the situation as quickly as possible. The patrol unit confirmed they would immediately contact regional command, but Sarah knew that even the fastest response would take at least 20 minutes to reach Fort Harrison. She had to find another way to warn the soldiers in the barracks. The base's public address system was controlled from the communication hub, but the primary controls had been destroyed along with everything else. However, Sarah remembered that there were manual override stations located throughout the base legacy systems from the Cold War era that could activate emergency broadcasts independently. The nearest manual station was in the base library, a 2-minute sprint through corridors that might be monitored by hostile forces. But it was her only option. Sarah secured the emergency radio and prepared to leave the communication hub. As she reached for the door controls, the light suddenly went out, plunging the entire facility into darkness. Emergency lighting flickered on moments later, casting eerie red shadows throughout the room. 6 minutes. She opened the door cautiously and peered into the corridor. The emergency lighting created a maze of shadows and blind spots where anyone could be hiding. Sarah drew her sidearm, standard issue for intelligence officers, and began moving toward the library. The corridors of Fort Harrison had never felt so threatening. Every doorway could hide an enemy operative. Every corner could be her last. But with each step, Sarah's resolve strengthened. 400 soldiers were depending on her, even though they didn't know it. She reached the library without incident and quickly located the manual override station hidden behind a false panel near the reference section. The system was older than she was, with mechanical switches and analog dials that looked like they belonged in a museum. But it was functional. Sarah began the activation sequence, her fingers working quickly despite the complexity of the controls. The manual override required a specific series of inputs to prevent accidental activation, and she had to recall the procedure from a training course she had taken 3 years earlier. 5 minutes. The system came online with a low hum. Sarah grabbed the microphone and prepared to broadcast a base-wide emergency alert that would wake every soldier in the barracks and send them to designated safe areas. But as she pressed the transmit button, she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the library. "Lieutenant Chen," called a voice with the same accent she had heard in the storage room. We know you're in there. You've done very well to make it this far, but your efforts are pointless. In 5 minutes, this entire base will be nothing but rubble. Sarah kept her finger on the transmit button but remained silent. Any broadcast now would immediately reveal her location to the hostile forces. You have a choice to make, Lieutenant, the voice continued. You can attempt to warn your colleagues and die with them, or you can surrender now and live. We have no quarrel with you personally. You are simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. 4 minutes. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could surrender and hope that somehow the sleeping soldiers would survive the explosion, though she knew that was impossible. She could attempt to fight her way out and try to reach the barracks personally, but that would take more time than she had available. Or she could make the broadcast and accept whatever consequences followed. The footsteps were getting closer. Sarah could hear multiple sets of boots moving through the library, systematically checking each section. They would find her within moments. She made her decision. All personnel, this is Lieutenant Sarah Chen with emergency authorization code Delta 77 Alpha. Fort Harrison is under attack by hostile forces. Explosive devices have been planted in the ammunition storage facility beneath the main barracks. All personnel in buildings 7 through 12 must evacuate immediately to Assembly Point Delta. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The library erupted in gunfire as Sarah dove behind the heavy wooden reference desk. Bullets splintered the wood around her as she continued broadcasting. Enemy operatives are on base. Communications are compromised. The senior staff is incapacitated. All able personnel must immediately secure the ammunition storage facility and assist with evacuation procedures. 3 minutes. Sarah released the transmit button and crawled toward the emergency exit at the rear of the library. Through the windows, she could see lights beginning to come on in the barracks buildings. Her message had gotten through. But now she had to survive long enough to see if it made a difference. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The emergency exit from the library led directly into the base's central courtyard, where chaos was already beginning to unfold. Sarah could hear the distant sound of soldiers shouting orders and boots pounding against concrete as her warning triggered the evacuation protocols. Emergency lighting bathed the entire courtyard in an otherworldly red glow, transforming the familiar landscape into something from a nightmare. 2 minutes and 45 seconds. Sarah pressed herself against the brick wall of the library, scanning the courtyard for enemy operatives. The tactical advantage had shifted completely. While her broadcast had successfully alerted the base personnel, it had also revealed her position to every hostile force on the premises. She was now the primary target, and they would stop at nothing to silence her before she could cause further disruption to their carefully orchestrated plan. A burst of automatic gunfire echoed from inside the library, followed by angry shouting in the same foreign accent she had heard earlier. They had discovered her escape route and were mobilizing to pursue her. Sarah estimated she had perhaps 30 seconds before they emerged into the courtyard. The ammunition storage facility was located 400 yards across the base, beneath the main barracks complex. Even if she could reach it, she had no idea how to disarm explosive devices, and attempting to do so might trigger them prematurely. Her only viable option was to find someone with the technical expertise to handle the situation. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez came to mind immediately. The demolitions expert had served 2 tours in Afghanistan and was currently assigned to the base's engineering unit. His quarters were in Building 4, which meant he should have been among the first to receive her evacuation warning. If anyone could neutralize the threat, it would be Rodriguez. Sarah sprinted across the courtyard, staying low and using the emergency lighting to create confusing shadows that would make her harder to track. Behind her, she heard the library's emergency exit burst open with a loud bang. "Target is moving toward the residential sector," someone shouted. "Teams 2 and 3, establish a perimeter around buildings 1 through 6. Quote, "The enemy forces were adapting quickly to the changing situation, implementing containment procedures designed to prevent her from reaching potential allies." Sarah realized they had studied Fort Harrison's layout extensively and knew exactly how to control movement throughout the base. She reached the covered walkway that connected the administrative buildings to the residential quarters, just as searchlights began sweeping across the courtyard. The hostile forces had brought sophisticated equipment that turned the familiar base into a hunting ground where she was the prey. 2 minutes and 20 seconds. The residential sector was alive with activity as soldiers responded to her emergency broadcast. Men and women in various states of dress were pouring out of their quarters, some carrying weapons, others helping to organize the evacuation of personnel from the threatened buildings. Sarah spotted Sergeant Rodriguez near Building 4, directing a group of junior enlisted personnel toward the designated assembly point. His demolition kit was slung over his shoulder. Apparently, he had grabbed his essential equipment before evacuating his quarters. "Rodriguez!" Sarah called out as she approached, careful to keep her voice low enough to avoid attracting unwanted attention. The sergeant turned, his weathered face showing immediate recognition despite the chaos surrounding them. Mike Rodriguez was a career soldier who had earned his stripes in some of the most dangerous environments the military had to offer. His calm demeanor under pressure had saved countless lives during his deployments overseas. "Lieutenant Chen, what's your status? We received your emergency broadcast, but the command structure is completely dark. No one knows what's happening." Sarah quickly explained the situation, including the location of the explosive devices and the timeline they were facing. Rodriguez's expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed the information. 2 minutes to disarm charges in the ammunition storage facility? Rodriguez shook his head. "Ma'am, that's barely enough time to locate the devices, let alone neutralize them safely. What would you need to make it work?" Rodriguez considered the question while automatic gunfire erupted somewhere behind them. The enemy forces were engaging with base security personnel who had responded to the emergency alert. "I'd need direct access to the storage facility, proper lighting, and someone to watch my back while I work. But Lieutenant, if these devices are as sophisticated as you're describing, there's a real possibility that any attempt to disarm them could trigger the detonation." 2 minutes. Sarah felt the weight of 400 lives pressing down on her shoulders. Every second of delay brought them closer to a catastrophic explosion that would level half of Fort Harrison. "There has to be another way," she insisted. Rodriguez was already moving toward the ammunition storage facility, his demolition kit in hand. "Maybe there is, but we won't know until we get eyes on the devices themselves. Sometimes the best way to disarm a bomb is to understand exactly how it's supposed to work." They began making their way toward the threatened building, moving carefully through the residential sector where evacuation procedures were still in progress. Sarah noticed that the enemy forces seemed to be concentrating their efforts on containing the situation rather than pursuing her directly. This suggested they were confident that their primary objective would succeed regardless of her actions. The ammunition storage facility was a reinforced concrete structure that had been built during the Cold War to withstand direct military attack. Multiple levels underground housed everything from small arms ammunition to artillery shells, with the most dangerous materials stored in the deepest sections. If the explosive devices were positioned correctly, the resulting chain reaction would be devastating. As they approached the facility's main entrance, Sarah saw Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh coordinating the evacuation of personnel from the barracks buildings. Walsh was the senior non-commissioned officer responsible for the soldiers' welfare, and her organizational skills were clearly evident as she efficiently directed the movement of hundreds of people towards safety. "Staff Sergeant Walsh," Sarah called out. Walsh turned, her face showing relief at seeing a commissioned officer who could potentially take command of the chaotic situation. "Lieutenant Chen, thank God. We've evacuated approximately 300 personnel from the threatened buildings. But we're still missing about 100 soldiers who were either on duty elsewhere or didn't respond to the initial alert." 1 minute and 40 seconds. "How long until the evacuation is complete?" Sarah asked. "At least 5 more minutes, assuming we don't encounter any complications." Sarah felt her heart sink. They didn't have 5 minutes. They barely had one. Rodriguez had reached the entrance to the ammunition storage facility and was examining the electronic lock system. "The access controls have been tampered with," he reported. "Someone's bypassed the normal security protocols." Sarah joined him at the entrance, noting the small electronic device that had been attached to the lock mechanism. "Can you get us inside?" "Not without triggering whatever alert system they've installed. This device is designed to notify them if anyone attempts unauthorized access." The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted their conversation. Sarah looked up to see military trucks racing toward their position from multiple directions. For a moment, she felt hope that reinforcements had arrived, but her optimism vanished when she realized the vehicles were moving in perfect formation, too perfect for a hasty response to an emergency situation. "Those aren't our people," Rodriguez said grimly. The trucks screeched to a halt in a semicircle around the ammunition storage facility, and armed figures in tactical gear began pouring out. Sarah counted at least 20 enemy operatives, all carrying military-grade weapons and moving with the precision of a well-trained unit. 1 minute and 15 seconds. "Lieutenant Chen," called a familiar voice. It was the same man who had spoken to her in the library. "You've caused considerable disruption to our operation, but it's time to end this charade." The man stepped forward, removing his tactical helmet to reveal a face that Sarah recognized from intelligence briefings. Viktor Petrov, a former Special Forces operator who had become one of the most wanted international terrorists after defecting from his home country's military. "You know who I am," Petrov continued, apparently noting her recognition. "Then you understand that this operation has been planned for months. Every contingency has been considered, including the possibility of discovery by base personnel." Sarah raised her sidearm, though she knew it was largely a symbolic gesture against such overwhelming odds. "Your plan failed. The soldiers are being evacuated. You won't achieve the casualty numbers you're after." Petrov smiled coldly. "Actually, Lieutenant, our plan is proceeding exactly as intended. You see, the explosive devices in the ammunition storage facility represent only Phase 2 of our operation. Phase 3 involves the systematic elimination of any survivors who manage to escape the initial blast." The terrorist gestured toward his operatives, who had positioned themselves to control all approaches to the facility. "Even if every soldier on this base manages to evacuate the barracks, they're now concentrated in predictable assembly areas where they can be eliminated efficiently." 55 seconds. Sarah realized with growing horror that her emergency broadcast, while saving lives in the immediate term, had actually facilitated the enemy's broader objectives. By forcing the evacuation, she had helped gather the base personnel into concentrated groups that would be vulnerable to follow-up attacks. "However," Petrov continued, "I'm prepared to offer you a final opportunity to minimize the loss of life. Order your people to stand down and surrender. My operatives will take them as prisoners rather than eliminate them outright." Rodriguez stepped forward, his demolition kit still slung over his shoulder. "And what guarantee do we have that you'll honor that agreement?" "You have my word as a professional soldier." "The word of a terrorist and a traitor," Sarah replied. "That's worth less than nothing." Petrov's expression hardened. "Very well, you've made your choice." He raised his hand, apparently preparing to signal his operatives to begin the final phase of their attack. Sarah knew that in seconds the ammunition storage facility would explode, and the systematic murder of Fort Harrison's personnel would begin. But before Petrov could give the signal, a new sound filled the air, the distinctive roar of military helicopters approaching at high speed. 40 seconds. "Night Watch 3 to Fort Harrison Intelligence," crackled Sarah's emergency radio. "We have multiple attack helicopters inbound to your position. Take cover immediately." The cavalry had arrived, but they were cutting it dangerously close. Petrov's confident expression faltered as he looked up at the approaching aircraft. Sarah could see him making rapid calculations, weighing the benefits of proceeding with the operation against the risks of engaging with a superior force. "All teams, prepare for immediate extraction," Petrov barked into his communication device. "Detonate charges in 30 seconds regardless of helicopter presence." Sarah's blood ran cold. Even with military support incoming, they were still going to proceed with the explosion that would level the ammunition storage facility and potentially kill any personnel who hadn't completed the evacuation. Rodriguez was already moving toward the facility entrance, his hands working quickly to assemble some kind of device from his demolition kit. "Lieutenant, I need you to buy me 20 seconds. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to try to create a controlled detonation that might disrupt their charges before they can achieve maximum effect." 25 seconds. Sarah turned back toward Petrov and his operatives, who were now preparing defensive positions to engage the incoming helicopters while maintaining their schedule for the facility destruction. She raised her weapon and began firing, not with any expectation of causing significant casualties, but simply to create confusion and delay their operations by even a few precious seconds. The courtyard erupted in gunfire as Petrov's operatives returned fire while simultaneously preparing for helicopter engagement. The night sky was filled with the sound of rotor blades and the distinctive whine of military aircraft engines pushed to their operational limits. 15 seconds. Rodriguez had attached some kind of shaped charge to the ammunition storage facility's entrance and was making final adjustments to the timing mechanism. Sarah realized he was attempting to blow open the facility so he could reach the enemy's explosive devices before they detonated. "Rodriguez, there's no time!" "Trust me, Lieutenant." 10 seconds. The first military helicopter crested the tree line surrounding Fort Harrison, its searchlight illuminating the entire scene. Sarah could see door gunners preparing to engage the terrorist operatives, but she knew they couldn't risk firing too close to the ammunition storage facility. 5 seconds. Rodriguez's shaped charge detonated with a sharp crack, blowing open the reinforced entrance to the underground facility. Without hesitation, the sergeant disappeared into the smoke and debris, racing against time to reach the enemy's explosives. 3 seconds. Sarah held her breath, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether her decision to warn the base had saved 400 lives or simply prolonged their inevitable deaths. 2 seconds. 1 second. The world went white. The explosion that Sarah expected never came. Instead, a series of smaller detonations echoed from deep within the ammunition storage facility, followed by the distinctive sound of electrical systems shorting out. Rodriguez had somehow managed to disrupt the enemy's primary charges, but the facility's emergency lighting was now flickering ominously, and acrid smoke was beginning to pour from the entrance. "Rodriguez!" Sarah shouted into the smoke-filled opening, but there was no response. Above them, the military helicopters had engaged Petrov's operatives in a fierce firefight. Tracer rounds lit up the night sky as door gunners targeted the terrorist positions, while trying to avoid hitting the compromised ammunition storage facility. The thunderous roar of rotor blades, mixed with the staccato burst of automatic weapons, created a symphony of modern warfare. Staff Sergeant Walsh appeared at Sarah's side, her face streaked with soot and her uniform torn from helping evacuate personnel through debris-filled corridors. "Lieutenant, we've accounted for 370 soldiers from the barracks buildings. 30 are still unaccounted for, but they might be on perimeter duty or in other facilities." Sarah's mind raced through the implications. If Rodriguez had successfully prevented the main explosion, those 30 missing soldiers were still alive but potentially in danger from Petrov's follow-up operations. The terrorist had made it clear that his plan involved multiple phases, and she had no doubt that he would adapt quickly to the changing circumstances. "What's the status of Colonel Morrison and the senior staff?" Sarah asked. "Still unconscious in the officers' club. We have medical personnel attending to them, but whatever they were exposed to is keeping them sedated. We're essentially operating without any command structure above the company level." A massive explosion from across the base interrupted their conversation. Sarah looked up to see flames and smoke rising from the direction of the vehicle depot. Petrov's teams were systematically destroying Fort Harrison's assets to prevent any organized resistance or pursuit when they eventually extracted from the area. "We need to get Rodriguez out of there and establish some kind of defensive perimeter," Sarah decided. "Walsh, can you coordinate with the helicopter crews to provide cover while we assess the facility?" "Roger that, Lieutenant." Quote. Sarah grabbed a tactical flashlight from one of the emergency supply boxes and prepared to enter the ammunition storage facility. The smoke was thicker now, and she could smell the distinctive odor of burned electronics mixed with something else, something chemical that made her eyes water. The entrance corridor partially collapsed from Rodriguez's shaped charge, but there was enough clearance for a person to squeeze through. Sarah called out again for the sergeant but heard only the echo of her own voice. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls, and the air grew thicker with each step she took deeper into the facility. The ammunition storage facility was laid out in a grid pattern, with multiple levels connected by reinforced stairwells designed to contain any accidental explosions. Sarah had studied the blueprints during her intelligence training, but navigating the actual structure in near darkness while breathing smoke-contaminated air was an entirely different challenge. She found Rodriguez on the second sublevel, unconscious but breathing, lying next to a collection of sophisticated electronic devices that had been partially destroyed by his improvised countermeasures. His demolition kit was scattered around him, and she could see that he had worked frantically to disable as many of the enemy charges as possible before succumbing to whatever had rendered him unconscious. Sarah checked his pulse and found it strong but irregular. The chemical smell was much stronger here, suggesting that Petrov's operatives had deployed some kind of gas or aerosol agent to incapacitate anyone who might attempt to interfere with their explosives. Rodriguez had probably managed to hold his breath long enough to disrupt several devices before the fumes overwhelmed him. She began dragging the unconscious sergeant toward the stairwell, but stopped when she heard footsteps echoing from somewhere deeper in the facility. Multiple sets of boots were moving with purpose through the lower levels, suggesting that Petrov had sent a team to assess the damage and possibly reactivate any charges that Rodriguez had failed to disable. Sarah drew her sidearm and found a position where she could observe the main corridor while remaining concealed behind a support pillar. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. Instead of trying to prevent an explosion, she was now engaged in underground combat against an unknown number of enemy operatives in an environment filled with enough ammunition to level several city blocks. 3 figures emerged from the stairwell leading to the deeper levels, moving in standard tactical formation with military precision. They were carrying equipment that Sarah didn't recognize, sophisticated electronic devices that were probably designed to reactivate the explosive charges that Rodriguez had disrupted. The lead operative was speaking into a communication device. "Control, this is the demolition team. We have extensive damage to the primary charges on levels 2 and 3. Someone with considerable expertise has systematically disabled our devices." "Can you restore the charges?" came the reply through the operative's earpiece. "Negative. The damage is too extensive. We'll need to place new charges, but that will require at least 15 minutes to complete properly." Sarah felt a surge of hope. Rodriguez had bought them precious time, but she knew that Petrov wouldn't abandon his objective simply because of a temporary setback. He would adapt his plan and find another way to achieve the same devastating result. The demolition team split up, with 2 operatives heading toward different sections of the facility, while the third remained in the main corridor to provide security. Sarah realized this was her opportunity to disrupt their efforts before they could reestablish the threat to the base. She waited until the security operative's attention was focused on monitoring the stairwell, then emerged from her concealment and moved silently toward his position. Years of intelligence training had taught her how to move without creating noise, and the ambient sound of the ongoing battle above ground helped mask any inadvertent sounds she might make. The operative was so focused on watching for threats from above that he never sensed Sarah's approach from behind. She struck him with the butt of her pistol at the base of his skull, and he collapsed without making a sound. Sarah quickly secured his weapon and communication device, then dragged his unconscious form behind the same pillar where she had been hiding. Through the operative's earpiece, she could hear the other 2 team members reporting their progress. "Control, Demolition 2 has reached the tertiary storage area, beginning placement of new charges. Control, Demolition 3 is in position at the primary junction. The estimated completion time is 12 minutes. Sarah keyed the communication device and attempted to mimic the unconscious operative's voice. "Control, Demolition 1 has encountered resistance in the main corridor. Request immediate backup." "Negative, Demolition 1. All teams are committed to other objectives. Handle the situation with available resources." The deception had failed, but Sarah had learned valuable information. The enemy had teams operating throughout Fort Harrison, and their resources were stretched thin enough that they couldn't spare additional personnel for the ammunition facility. This suggested that her emergency broadcast had forced them to commit more operatives to containing the evacuation than they had originally planned. Sarah began moving deeper into the facility, using her knowledge of the layout to intercept the demolition teams before they could complete their work. The chemical contamination was getting worse as she descended, and she found herself holding her breath for longer periods to avoid inhaling whatever had rendered Rodriguez unconscious. She reached the tertiary storage area just as Demolition 2 was attaching an explosive device to a rack of artillery shells. The operative was working methodically, apparently unaware that his security backup had been neutralized. Sarah positioned herself behind a stack of ammunition crates and called out, "Drop your weapons and step away from the explosives." The operative spun around, his weapon already in his hands, but Sarah had anticipated this reaction. She fired twice, the sound of her pistol echoing through the concrete chambers like thunder. The operative stumbled backward and collapsed against the ammunition rack. But her shots had alerted Demolition 3 to her presence, and she could hear him moving quickly through the facility toward her location. Sarah grabbed the partially assembled explosive device and examined it quickly. The design was more sophisticated than anything she had encountered during her training, but she could see that it was designed to detonate in a cascade that would trigger the stored ammunition. She began attempting to disarm the device using techniques Rodriguez had shown her during joint training exercises, but the complexity of the electronics was beyond her expertise. Instead, she focused on physically separating the detonator from the main charge, hoping that breaking the connection would render it harmless. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the storage area. Demolition 3 was approaching cautiously, probably aware that his team member had been neutralized. Sarah positioned herself where she could observe the entrance while continuing to work on the explosive device. "I know you're in there," called a voice with a slight accent. "You've caused considerable disruption, but you're only delaying the inevitable. Even if you disable every charge in this facility, we have alternative methods to achieve our objectives." Sarah didn't respond, focusing instead on the intricate wiring of the detonator. She could see that removing the wrong component might trigger the device prematurely, but leaving it intact would eventually result in the same catastrophic explosion they were trying to prevent. "Fort Harrison will be destroyed tonight," the voice continued. "The only question is whether it happens quickly or slowly. Surrender now, and I'll ensure your death is quick." Sarah finally managed to separate the detonator from the main charge, but she had no way of knowing whether the device had other triggering mechanisms. She secured the components in different areas of the storage room, then prepared to deal with the remaining operative. The sound of movement in the corridor had stopped, suggesting that Demolition 3 was trying to determine her exact location before making his approach. Sarah used this opportunity to move to a different position in the storage area, where she would have a better angle of attack when he eventually entered. Minutes passed in tense silence. Sarah could hear the ongoing battle above ground, but down in the depths of the ammunition facility, the war had become intensely personal. Two people with opposing objectives, fighting for control of enough explosive power to reshape the landscape of Fort Harrison. A small object rolled into the storage area from the corridor, a cylindrical device that immediately began emitting a hissing sound. Sarah recognized it as some kind of gas grenade, probably containing the same chemical agent that had incapacitated Rodriguez. She covered her nose and mouth with her shirt and moved quickly toward the storage area's secondary exit, but found it blocked by debris from an earlier explosion. The gas was spreading rapidly through the enclosed space, and she could already feel her eyes beginning to burn. Demolition 3 appeared in the main entrance, wearing a gas mask and carrying an assault rifle. He began systematically searching the storage area, using the spreading chemical cloud to force Sarah into the open. Sarah realized she had only seconds before the gas rendered her as helpless as Rodriguez. She made a desperate decision. Instead of trying to fight the operative directly, she would attempt to trigger a controlled explosion that would collapse this section of the facility and prevent any future attempts to place charges here. She grabbed one of the partially disarmed explosive devices and began reassembling it with different connections, trying to create a small blast that would bring down the ceiling without triggering the stored ammunition. Her vision was beginning to blur from the chemical agent, and her hands were shaking as she worked. "Stop," commanded Demolition 3, his rifle now pointed directly at her. "Step away from the device." Sarah looked up at him through the gas mask that concealed his features, then back down at the explosive device in her hands. She had managed to create what she hoped was a limited-yield charge that would collapse the storage area without causing a chain reaction. "If you pull that trigger, this entire facility goes up," Sarah said, hoping her bluff was convincing. "And you go up with it." The operative hesitated, apparently weighing the risks of shooting her while she held a potentially unstable explosive device. Sarah used that moment of hesitation to complete the final connection and activate the timer she had jerry-rigged from components of the original device. 5 seconds, she announced, then rolled toward the nearest cover as Demolition 3 opened fire. The storage area disappeared in a thunderous explosion that shook the entire facility. Sarah regained consciousness to the sound of drilling equipment and urgent voices echoing from above. Her ears were ringing from the explosion, and a layer of concrete dust covered everything around her. The controlled detonation had worked exactly as she had hoped. The storage area's ceiling had collapsed, sealing off that section of the facility and making it impossible for anyone to place additional charges there. But she was now trapped beneath tons of rubble, with no clear escape route. Through the debris, she could hear the voices of rescue personnel working to reach her. The drilling sound suggested they were using heavy equipment to cut through the collapsed concrete, but Sarah knew that process could take hours, time that Fort Harrison didn't have. "Lieutenant Chen, can you hear us?" The voice belonged to Staff Sergeant Walsh, who was apparently coordinating the rescue effort from the surface. "I'm here," Sarah called back, her voice hoarse from the dust and chemical contamination. "Rodriguez is down here too, but he's unconscious. We need immediate medical attention." "Roger that, Lieutenant. We have medical teams standing by. How's your structural situation down there?" Sarah examined her surroundings as best she could in the dim light filtering through cracks in the debris. The explosion had created a pocket of space around her position, but the stability was questionable. More concerning was the fact that she could smell gas leaking from damaged pipes somewhere in the facility. "Structurally unstable, and we have a gas leak. You need to evacuate the area above us before attempting any heavy excavation." "Understood. We're bringing in specialized rescue equipment." While Sarah waited for the rescue operation to progress, she could hear the ongoing battle on the surface. The helicopter engagement seemed to have intensified, with multiple aircraft now involved in the firefight. But there were also new sounds, the rumble of heavy vehicles and the distinct crack of tank cannons firing. The Regional Military Command had apparently responded to the emergency with significant force, turning Fort Harrison into an active battlefield. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that substantial reinforcements had arrived, but concern about the level of destruction that such a battle would inflict on the base and its personnel. She found Rodriguez approximately 10 feet away, still unconscious but breathing steadily. The explosion had thrown him clear of the worst debris, and he appeared to have no serious injuries beyond his exposure to the chemical agent. Sarah managed to reach him by crawling through the narrow spaces between fallen concrete slabs. "Rodriguez, can you hear me?" She checked his pulse again and found it stronger than before, suggesting that his body was beginning to process whatever chemical had rendered him unconscious. The sergeant's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, but gradually gaining awareness of his surroundings. "Lieutenant, what happened? Did we stop the charges?" "You stopped them. The main explosion was prevented, but we're trapped in the facility. Rescue teams are working to reach us." Rodriguez sat up slowly, wincing as he moved. "How long was I out?" "Maybe 20 minutes. The battle's still going on above us, but it sounds like we have significant reinforcements now." The drilling sounds from above had stopped, replaced by a different type of mechanical noise that Sarah couldn't immediately identify. Then Walsh's voice came through the debris again, but this time it carried a note of urgency. "Lieutenant Chen, we have a problem. Petrov's forces have taken control of the base communications center and are broadcasting demands to the regional command. They're threatening to detonate secondary charges throughout Fort Harrison unless their extraction demands are met." Sarah felt her heart sink. Despite all their efforts to prevent the primary explosion, Petrov had apparently prepared contingency plans that would still allow him to achieve significant destruction of the base. "What kind of demands?" Sarah called back. "They want guaranteed safe passage for their entire team and a 2-hour delay before any pursuit begins. In exchange, they'll provide the locations of all remaining explosive devices." Rodriguez was now fully alert and had begun examining their situation with the professional eye of someone trained in demolitions and structural engineering. "Lieutenant, even if they're telling the truth about the locations, disarming multiple charges scattered throughout the base would take longer than 2 hours. They're planning to detonate everything remotely once they reach their extraction point." Sarah realized that Petrov had anticipated the possibility of his primary plan failing and had prepared multiple layers of backup objectives. Even if Fort Harrison's personnel survived the immediate threat, the terrorist would still achieve his goal of destroying the base's operational capacity. "Walsh, what's the response from the regional command?" Sarah asked. "They're refusing to negotiate. A full assault is being prepared to retake the communications center and neutralize all hostile forces on the base." The mechanical noise from above intensified, and Sarah realized that heavy excavation equipment was being positioned directly over their location. But instead of the careful drilling operation she had expected, this sounded like they were preparing for rapid excavation regardless of the structural risks. "Walsh, are you using explosive charges to clear the debris?" "Negative, Lieutenant. We have a new problem. Intelligence reports indicate that Petrov has planted charges in the facility's main support structure." If those detonate, the entire underground complex will collapse, including the sections where you're trapped. Sarah and Rodriguez exchanged grim looks. They were caught in the middle of a three-dimensional battle. Petrov's forces controlled key positions on the surface. Regional Command was preparing a full assault, and they were trapped underground in a facility that could collapse at any moment. "We need to find our own way out," Rodriguez said flatly. "Even if the rescue teams reach us, we'll just be trading one trap for another if this place comes down." Sarah examined their surroundings more carefully, looking for any possible escape route that didn't require excavation from above. The explosion had revealed part of an older tunnel system that predated the current facility, probably maintenance tunnels from the base's original construction. "Rodriguez, look at this!" She pointed to a section of wall where the explosion had blown away modern concrete panels to reveal older brick construction underneath. "This might connect to the original base infrastructure." Rodriguez moved to examine the exposed section, running his hands along the brickwork to assess its condition. "This is definitely older construction, probably from the 1940s. If we can break through here, we might be able to access tunnels that lead to other parts of the base." They began working together to clear debris from the exposed wall section, using pieces of concrete as improvised tools to chip away at the old mortar between the bricks. The work was slow and physically demanding, made more difficult by the poor air quality and unstable conditions around them. As they worked, Sarah could hear the battle above ground reaching a crescendo. The sound of tank fire was now constant, mixed with the roar of military helicopters and the distinctive crack of high-powered rifles. Whatever assault the Regional Command had planned was apparently underway. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez said as they broke through the first layer of brickwork, "I can feel air movement on the other side. This definitely connects to something." Quote, They redoubled their efforts, and within minutes had created an opening large enough to squeeze through. Sarah went first, using her tactical flashlight to illuminate the space beyond the wall. She found herself in a narrow tunnel that stretched in both directions, with cables and pipes running along the walls. The construction was definitely from an earlier era, but the tunnel was in remarkably good condition. More importantly, she could see natural light coming from somewhere to her left. "Rodriguez, we have a way out." The sergeant joined her in the tunnel, and they began moving toward the source of light. The passage was cramped and required them to move in a crouch, but it was structurally sound and free of the chemical contamination that had plagued the modern facility. As they progressed, Sarah could hear new voices echoing through the tunnel system, but these weren't rescue personnel or enemy operatives. The accents were distinctly American, and the communication style suggested regular military personnel. "This is Alpha Team. We've secured the eastern approach to the communication center. Bravo Team, what's your status?" "Bravo Team is in position at the southern entrance. We have visual confirmation of at least 6 hostile forces inside the building." Sarah and Rodriguez were inadvertently listening to the Regional Command's assault coordination through the base's older communication infrastructure that apparently ran through these tunnels. "Charlie Team, begin your approach from the western side. Delta Team, maintain overwatch and be prepared to provide suppressive fire." Rodriguez tapped Sarah on the shoulder and pointed ahead. The tunnel was widening, and they could see that it opened into a larger chamber that appeared to be some kind of utility junction. More importantly, they could see a metal ladder leading upward toward what was obviously a surface access point. They reached the ladder and began climbing toward the surface, emerging through a utility cover that was concealed behind a maintenance building on the far side of the base from where the main battle was taking place. The night air felt incredibly fresh after the contaminated atmosphere of the underground facility. From their position, they had a clear view of the communications center, where Petrov had established his command post. The building was surrounded by Regional Command forces, with armored vehicles positioned to provide both protection and firepower. Tracer rounds were streaking back and forth between the building and the surrounding positions. But Sarah also noticed something that the assault teams probably couldn't see from their positions. There were additional figures moving on the roof of the communications center, apparently preparing some kind of equipment that wasn't visible from ground level. "Rodriguez, do you see what they're doing on the roof?" The sergeant studied the building through the scope of a rifle he had acquired from somewhere during their underground journey. "That looks like communications equipment. Probably a satellite uplink or directional antenna." Sarah realized what was happening. While Regional Command was focused on the ground-level battle, Petrov was preparing to communicate with external forces, possibly to coordinate his extraction or to trigger remote detonation of charges throughout the base. "We need to warn the assault teams," Sarah said. But before they could make contact with the regional command forces, a new sound filled the air, the distinctive whine of incoming artillery shells. Petrov had apparently succeeded in communicating with external forces, and those forces were now providing fire support to prevent his capture. The first shells landed in the areas where regional commands had positioned their vehicles, creating massive explosions that lit up the night sky. Sarah and Rodriguez threw themselves to the ground as shrapnel whistled overhead. "He's got external support," Rodriguez observed grimly. "This isn't just a terrorist operation. This is coordinated military action." Sarah grabbed her emergency radio and began attempting to contact the assault teams. Alpha Team, this is Lieutenant Chen. You have hostile artillery targeting your positions from external sources." "Lieutenant Chen? We thought you were trapped underground. What's your location?" "East side of the base, near the utility buildings. The hostiles have established communication with external forces, who are providing artillery support. You need to neutralize the equipment on the communications center roof before they can coordinate additional strikes." "Roger that, Lieutenant. Can you provide overwatch and target designation from your position?" Sarah looked at Rodriguez, who nodded grimly. They had managed to escape one trap, only to find themselves in the middle of an even larger battle. But at least now they were in a position to actively contribute to stopping Petrov's operation. "Affirmative, Alpha Team. We're moving to an overwatch position now." The battle for Fort Harrison was about to enter its final phase. Sarah and Rodriguez sprinted across the open ground between the utility buildings and the water tower that would provide them with the elevated position they needed for effective overwatch. Artillery shells continued to rain down on the regional command positions, creating a hellscape of fire and debris that transformed the familiar landscape of Fort Harrison into an unrecognizable battlefield. From their new vantage point atop the water tower, Sarah could see the full scope of the battle unfolding below. Regional Command had deployed approximately 200 soldiers, supported by armored vehicles, attack helicopters, and what appeared to be a mobile artillery unit that was attempting to counter the incoming fire from Petrov's external supporters. But the terrorist leader had chosen his position brilliantly. The communications center was a reinforced concrete structure that could withstand significant bombardment, and its position at the center of the base made it impossible for the assault teams to approach without exposing themselves to fire from multiple directions. "Alpha Team, this is Chen. I have a visual on the communications center roof. Count 4 hostiles operating what appears to be a sophisticated satellite communication array." "Roger that, Chen. We need those communications disrupted before they can call in additional artillery strikes. Can you provide target designation for helicopter attack?" Sarah studied the roof through Rodriguez's rifle scope. The satellite array was positioned behind a low wall that provided protection from ground-level fire, but it would be vulnerable to attack from above if a helicopter could get close enough. "Negative on helicopter attack. They have shoulder-fired missiles on the roof. I count at least 2 operators with what looks like Stinger systems." Rodriguez was examining the building's structure with the professional eye of a demolitions expert. "Lieutenant, look at the base of the building. See those utility access points? If we could get close enough, I might be able to disrupt their power supply or communication lines." Sarah evaluated the approach route. The communications center was surrounded by approximately 50 yards of open ground on all sides, with no cover except for a few scattered vehicle hulks from the earlier fighting. Anyone attempting to approach the building would be completely exposed to fire from the roof positions. "That's a suicide run, Rodriguez." "Maybe not," he replied, pointing toward the mobile artillery unit that the regional command had positioned on the northern edge of the base. "If they could provide smoke cover, we might be able to reach the building without being detected." Sarah keyed her radio. "Alpha Team, we need immediate smoke screen deployment on the western approach to the communications center. We're going to attempt to disrupt their power supply." "Chen, that's too dangerous. We have other options." "What other options?" "Every minute they maintain communications is another minute they can coordinate with their external support." "How many artillery strikes can your position sustain?" A massive explosion punctuated her question as another salvo of shells landed near the regional command vehicles. Sarah could see that several positions had already been abandoned due to the accurate fire from Petrov's supporters. "Point taken, Chen. Smoke deployment in 60 seconds. Be advised, we can only maintain the screen for approximately 3 minutes before our ammunition runs low." Sarah and Rodriguez began their descent from the water tower, planning their approach route while the mobile artillery unit prepared to fire smoke rounds. The timing would have to be perfect. Too early and the smoke would dissipate before they reached the building. Too late and they would be caught in the open when the screen cleared. The first smoke rounds impacted around the communications center with dull thuds, immediately beginning to obscure the area with thick gray clouds. Sarah and Rodriguez sprinted from their concealment, running in a zigzag pattern that would make them harder to target if anyone spotted them through the smoke. The approach felt like it took hours, though Sarah knew it was probably less than 2 minutes. The smoke was so thick that they had to navigate by compass bearing, and the sound of gunfire and explosions from all directions made it impossible to determine if they had been detected. They reached the communications center's western wall, just as the smoke began to thin. Rodriguez immediately began examining the utility access panels while Sarah provided security, scanning the surrounding area for any signs that their approach had been observed. "I found the main power junction," Rodriguez whispered. "Give me 2 minutes to rig a charge that will take out their electrical systems without bringing down the building." Sarah could hear movement on the roof above them, boots on concrete, and voices calling out instructions in the same foreign accent she had heard during her initial discovery of the terrorist operation. Petrov's operatives were apparently trying to re-establish visual contact with the regional command positions as the smoke cleared. "Faster, Rodriguez. They're moving around up there." The sergeant was working with the focused intensity that had made him one of the base's most respected demolitions experts, connecting components from his kit to create a precisely calibrated charge that would disable the building's power without causing structural damage. Almost done. This should take out everything. Lights, communications, ventilation, the works. A new sound interrupted their work, the distinctive whine of incoming missiles. Sarah looked up to see contrails streaking across the night sky, heading directly toward the regional command positions. Petrov's external supporters had escalated their involvement, deploying guided missiles instead of simple artillery. The first missile impacted the mobile artillery unit that had provided their smoke cover, creating a fireball that could be seen from miles away. The second and third missiles targeted the armored vehicles that had been providing protection for the assault teams. Alpha Team, do you copy?" Sarah called into her radio but received only static in response. Rodriguez completed his work on the power junction and activated the timer on his improvised charge. 30 seconds until detonation. We need to be clear of this area." But as they prepared to withdraw from the building, a spotlight suddenly illuminated them from the roof above. Sarah looked up to see Viktor Petrov himself leaning over the edge, a rifle pointed directly at their position. "Lieutenant Sarah Chen," he called down, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that followed the missile strikes. "You have been remarkably persistent, but your efforts have ultimately been futile." Sarah raised her own weapon, though she knew the angle made accurate fire nearly impossible. "Your operation has failed, Petrov. The soldiers are safe, and your primary objective has been neutralized." Petrov laughed, a sound that chilled Sarah more than any threat could have. "My primary objective was never simply to kill soldiers, Lieutenant. My objective was to demonstrate that even the most secure military installations in the world are vulnerable to a properly planned and executed operation." The terrorist gestured toward the burning wreckage that had been the regional command positions. "Look around you. Fort Harrison is in ruins. The base's operational capacity has been destroyed. Your command structure has been eliminated. Even if every soldier survives tonight, this installation will be useless for months." Rodriguez's charge detonated with a sharp crack, and the communications center was immediately plunged into darkness as all electrical systems failed. But Petrov's voice continued from the roof, now using some kind of battery-powered amplification system. "However, Lieutenant, your personal courage has impressed me. I'm prepared to offer you a final opportunity to minimize the destruction. My extraction helicopter will arrive in precisely 5 minutes. If you and your companion surrender now, I will provide the locations of all remaining charges on the base." Sarah felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had already prevented the catastrophic explosion that would have killed 400 soldiers. But Petrov was right about the base's condition. The infrastructure damage from the ongoing battle was extensive, and there might indeed be additional charges that could cause further destruction. "How do we know you'll honor that agreement?" Sarah called back. "Because I have no interest in unnecessary destruction. My operation has already achieved its primary objectives. The additional charges are simply insurance to ensure my successful extraction." Rodriguez moved closer to Sarah and spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the roof. "Lieutenant, I don't trust him, but we might not have any other choice. My equipment is exhausted, and we have no support from the regional command." Sarah looked around at the devastation surrounding the communications center. Petrov was correct that the base had sustained massive damage, but she also knew that surrender would likely mean execution once the terrorist leader was safely clear of the area. "Petrov," she called up, "what guarantee do we have that you won't simply detonate all charges once you're extracted? You have my word as a professional soldier. The word of a terrorist who has already murdered innocent people tonight. 3 minutes until extraction, Lieutenant. Decide quickly." Sarah made her decision, but it wasn't the one Petrov expected. Instead of surrendering, she began moving around the perimeter of the building, looking for a way to reach the roof. If Petrov was going to be extracted in 3 minutes, her only chance to prevent further destruction was to stop him before the helicopter arrived. Rodriguez understood her intention immediately and began providing covering fire as Sarah searched for access to the building's upper levels. The main entrance was undoubtedly secured by Petrov's operatives, but older buildings like the communications center often had external fire escapes or maintenance ladders. She found what she was looking for on the building's eastern side, a maintenance ladder that led to a service platform just below the roof level. The ladder was exposed and would leave her vulnerable to fire from the roof, but it was her only option. Sarah began climbing, using the darkness created by Rodriguez's charge to conceal her movement. She could hear the sound of an approaching helicopter in the distance. Petrov's extraction was right on schedule. As she reached the service platform, Sarah could see the terrorist leader and his remaining operatives preparing for extraction. They had set up a portable landing beacon and were securing equipment for transport. Petrov was holding what appeared to be a remote detonation device, the trigger for whatever charges remained on the base. Sarah drew her sidearm and prepared to make her final move. In the distance, she could see the lights of Petrov's extraction helicopter approaching Fort Harrison. She had perhaps 60 seconds before the terrorist leader would be beyond her reach forever. She took a deep breath, thought about the 400 soldiers whose lives had hung in the balance just hours earlier, and prepared to finish what she had started when she first discovered the terrorist operation in the storage room beneath the base. The helicopter was landing on the roof as Sarah emerged from the service platform, her weapon ready and her resolve unshakable. Viktor Petrov turned to face her, the detonation device still in his hand, and for a moment that lasted an eternity, their eyes met across the chaos of the burning base. "Last chance, Lieutenant Chen," Petrov shouted over the roar of the helicopter. "Surrender now, or watch Fort Harrison disappear in a series of explosions that will be seen from space." Sarah's response was clear and unwavering. "I made my choice 12 minutes ago when I decided that 400 soldiers were worth more than my own life. I'm making the same choice now." She raised her weapon, knowing that the next few seconds would determine not just her own fate, but the fate of everyone who called Fort Harrison home. The helicopter's rotors reached full speed as Sarah Chen prepared to write the final chapter of the most important 12 minutes of her life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.